The next chapter talks about identify IBM Cognos analytics architecture. So in this chapter, we'll talk about the features of IBM Cognos analytics architecture, the three different tiers. We'll talk about the data tier, the application tier, and the gateway tier. Cognos analytics servlets and services, how the services are arranged, where the dispatcher resides, what the dispatcher contains, the default servlet container alternatives to its use. So you can configure different servlet containers. Also, by default, it is WebSphere Liberty Profile. An example of IBM Cognos Analytics request processing. So once a request is sent to the IBM Cognos server, how does the processing takes place? Various installation options we'll talk about: single server installation, multiple server installation, or when we say multiple server installation, what components on different machines will give us what advantages or what disadvantages. Load balancing mechanisms. We'll talk about when you got multiple dispatchers, how can we achieve load balancing between the various dispatchers. And configuration options. So we'll talk about various configurations which can be achieved with distributed installation. And we'll talk about IBM Cognos application firewall too. In the administration workflow, we are now talking about the first three stages: planning, installing, and configuring. So we'll discuss this, and then after that, we will go to install of the IBM Cognos environment. Features of IBM Cognos architecture: zero footprint web administration. So when you're doing administration, you just need to know the URL of the server to be able to connect and administer the environment. A common dispatcher would be a feature which will be a central dispatcher, which will know the location of all other dispatchers. And the common dispatcher can then pass on requests to various other dispatchers. Scalability. So you are able to add new dispatchers to an environment which is existing, and users will not know that new dispatchers have been added because the request processing and request forwarding is independent, which is automatic. Users will not have to do anything to be able to utilize a newly installed dispatcher to the environment. Support for leading RDBMS for content management. So the content store can be created in any of the leading RDBMS providers. You can have it in SQL Server, you can have it in Oracle, you can have it in DB2, you can have it in other database providers also. Integration with web forms. So if you want to achieve the load balancing using Microsoft Web Forms, you can integrate Cognos environment with web forms also. Platform independence. You can install IBM Cognos Analytics on Windows, on Linux, or Unix. The installation could be a little different, but once installed, user experience will be exactly the same. Users would not know if the installation is on Linux or Unix or Windows. They would get exactly the same user experience. Openness and extensibility. It allows you to connect third-party applications and run reports directly from third-party applications. So it is open, and you are able to use APIs to connect to IBM Cognos environment from third-party applications. Support for multiple languages. You can have multiple languages in your database, or you can also have multiple languages for the product. So the product language can be changed based on the languages which are available. So you can see your Cognos environment completely in English or French or German or even Mandarin. So those languages are available. So your product language can be changed. 32-bit and 64-bit components. So you are able to set the report execution mode to 32-bit or 64-bit. If you want to have 64-bit, then you can only process 64-bit reports. But if you keep it to 32-bit, you are able to process 32-bit applications as well as 64-bit applications. So you can keep either 32-bit or 64-bit. 64-bit is more efficient, can utilize more memory. And if you intend to run dynamic cubes, then you have to have 64-bit because they are not supported by 32-bit. Multi-tiered architecture. So here we see various tiers which talk to each other through the network firewall or through Cognos' internal firewall. Web-based and Windows-based interfaces are what the users will be interacting with. So Cognos Analytics user interface can either be web-based, which are various studios, which we discussed in the last chapter, or it could be the modeling tools, which are Windows-based interfaces. So any of these users are using to connect to the IBM Cognos environment. Once they try to connect to the environment, they come to the web server. So in Cognos 11, web server is optional. You may or may not install a web server in IBM Cognos environment. The dispatcher is able to perform the functions of web server also. But in case you want to achieve load balancing, then you would install a web server, which can then pass on requests to various dispatchers. IBM Cognos Server, also called application server and is also called a dispatcher, is the lower layer. That is where all the processing happens. And it works with a BI bus, which is able to pass on requests through various services and able to fulfill user requests. The tier 3, the bottommost layer, is the data layer, where you will have content store, which needs JDBC connectivity. Metric source also needs JDBC connectivity. The query databases can be either connected through API or compatible query mode or dynamic query mode. So you are able to connect to the query databases that way. Tier 1, web server gateways optional. So web communication can be done through IBM Cognos Analytics Gateway, which resides on one or more web servers. So we can decide to install one web server or multiple web servers. If you install multiple web servers, then the load balancing will not be available unless you install an external load balancer between web servers. The load balancing between dispatchers is automatic, but within web servers, it is not. In a distributed installation, if you use optional gateway, it must be configured to communicate with a dispatcher, because web server automatically is not able to process the requests. It needs to transfer the request to a dispatcher, so it must be configured to communicate to a dispatcher. In IBM Cognos Analytics, the application tier provides the function of a gateway. So if you decide not to install a gateway, then the dispatcher can also work as a gateway.
I have a question. So would there be any performance impact? When do we need a web server? Under what concentration? Or what?
If you want to have load balancing between different dispatchers, you would need a web server. Because if you have multiple dispatchers and you do not install a web server, then each dispatcher will have its own URL. And users, when they give a URL for a node, they would be able to only connect to that particular dispatcher. If you want load balancing, which means dependent upon the dispatcher which is available to request, process the request, you should be able to automatically send the request to that particular dispatcher. You do need a web server.
So with a web server, is it possible to have more than one web server point to the same dispatcher?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So each web server will have its own address. So users, when they go to that particular web server, whatever dispatcher is connected to, the request can be sent to those dispatchers. If you want the users to be able to have only one URL, but still be able to go through multiple web servers, you need to install an external load balancer for the web servers, which is not native to Cognos.
So what are the web servers built on?
WebSphere, by default, WebSphere Liberty Profile, but you are able to use others also. If you want to configure others,
Okay. What others are there? Just
Tomcat,
a couple.
Tomcat could be another.
Okay.
So various web servers. So once you want to configure those, you need to read the administration and configuration guide, where you will be able to see how to configure other web servers.
So is this a new feature of Cognos 11, or was it in 10.2 as well?
The optional gateway is only from 11.
Okay.
Previously, you needed to have a gateway definitely, which was able to communicate to the dispatcher. In 11, the dispatcher itself can perform the functions of gateway if you want. So you can skip the gateway. But if you want to have load balancing, then you do need to install the gateway.
So can I have like one dispatcher per application and then configure the application tier so that each application can have its own dispatcher?
Why do you need that? How do you define the application?
See, in ODJFS, like each program offices have like multiple reports. So each there are a set of reports, say probably 1,000 reports per program office. So I was thinking, and there are multiple users per program. So would I use like one dispatcher for each of those program office? So
you don't need to. You don't need to. Okay. You don't need to. You can, but you don't need to. And in this training, you will see that in one of the chapters, we'll talk about routing rules. So if you do want to send the request from a particular group or particular application to a dispatcher, you can do that. But that dispatcher, if it is vacant, if it has got processing capacity, why do you want to just keep it for that application? Exactly. Others can also use it. So we don't actually use one dispatcher for one application. We'll have a number of dispatchers which are installed, and all applications can use it based on the availability of the processing capacity. Well, that load balancing is available internal to Cognos.
Okay.
Okay. So the tier 2, the application server, so it will process requests such as reports, analysis, and queries, which might be forwarded by a gateway. And it also renders the IBM Cognos Analytics user interfaces, like if you want to log in, that login page will be configured by the dispatcher. Once the report is run and the data is available, that output will be sent to the user by the dispatcher. So the tier 1 is on the top of Analytics server, which has got the services under the dispatcher, and the content manager is a separate container, which is under the application server, but it's its own separate container, servlet container, which has got Cognos Access Manager, which will connect to the content store and will also connect to the authentication providers to check the username and password of the users, to authenticate them to be able to connect to the environment. And below that, Analytics server is tier number 3. So when you say tier 2, the dispatcher will have all the services under the dispatcher. So all the services are here, and mobile services also a service under the dispatcher, which is now included by default. Compatible query mode and dynamic query mode. There are 2 query modes available. Compatible query mode is for 32-bit execution, and the dynamic query mode is for 64-bit application. So here is the request flow. So from the reporting, a request comes from the user. That request will ultimately result in a query being created for the database. That query in XML, when it comes to the query framework, it would be either created as an OLAP query if it is based on a cube, or a DMR query if it is based on a dimensionally modeled relational package, or a relational query if it is based on a relational database. If it is DMR or relational, both will be sent through a universal data access SQL via RDBMS adapters to the RDBMS database, because DMR as a relational ultimately has relational database at the bottom. So it would convert to a SQL which will be sent through RDBMS adapters to the databases. But if it is an OLAP query, which is based on a cube, then multi-dimensional data access will be used, MDX, and through OLAP adapters. So there is an adapter for Power cubes, for Sybase cubes, for Oracle cubes. So there are different cubes which have got their own adapters. So through that OLAP adapters, the data source will be connected to and the results will be obtained from the MDX SQL which is created. In the dynamic query mode, we do not have two different type of engines to plan the MDX query or to have the relational query. When the query comes from either reporting, dashboarding, or any other, the query comes in, that query is passed on to the transformation engine, which has got various caches available. Transformation libraries are available, log files are available, and there is member caches, data caches, result caches. These are all the caches available to the transformation engine, which will transform that query either to an MDX query or to a SQL query. The same query execution engine will create either a SQL or an MDX. And based on that, and it can also use data cache. If the data which is required is available in data cache, it would not send the SQL to the database, but will use data cache itself. And that is how it is able to give you faster performances. When it's trying to make an MDX query, it can also take advantage of member cache, which is available. So if a dimension has got members which are available in the cache, it does not need to send the query to the database to get the members. It can use it from the cache. But then the adapters which are used for relational query will be RDBMS adapters, and for the MDX query will be OLAP adapters, just similar to the compatible query mode, but there is only one query execution engine instead of two separate in compatible query mode. DQM and query service. So when we saw the services under the dispatcher, there is a service called query service. That query service itself will be processing dynamic query mode. So it's an extension of the query service. So dynamic query mode is an enhanced Java-based query mode which offers the following key capabilities: query optimizations, performance improvement through balanced local query processing facilities. So it is able to use the local disk where the transformation libraries, etc., would be stored. The caches would be stored to take advantage and do faster processing. Security aware caching. So caches which are available on the disk or on the local disk will be security aware. When the user who sends a request has got different security, then the caches will be filtered by the security. And if the user does not have access to the data which is available in the cache, the SQL would be sent to the database to get the data for that particular user. So the caches are security aware. Ability to take full advantage of 64-bit environment, because DQM does need 64-bit processing. A 64-bit environment is able to address much more computer memory and is able to use much more RAM to be able to give you faster performance. Ease of maintenance with query visualization. We've got tools available called query optimization, which can let us know the aggregates which will be needed to make your query execution faster. And we'll see that tool also in this training. DQM for dimensionally modeled relational packages. So dynamic query mode can also be used by DMR packages, which is dimensionally modeled relational packages. So DQM providers provide uses of OLAP experience over relational data. So relational data, you can have your relational database, but you can create dynamic cube based on the relational data. Improve ad hoc analysis capabilities through default member caching. If you use DQM, then all the members of the dimension would be automatically sorted. In compatible query mode, you are supposed to sort it, but in dynamic query mode, they'll be automatically sorted. Improved suppression. So the zero suppression or null suppression is much more efficient with dynamic query mode. Aggregate limitations removed. What does that mean? That if you are doing aggregates and any of the elements of the aggregate is a null value, then in compatible query mode, that aggregate will result to a null. Whereas in dynamic query mode, it is able to convert null values to 0 and still give us relevant values from the aggregates. Nulls as zeros in arithmetic operations. So we are able to specify that null should be treated as zeros in arithmetic operations, so the resultant does not automatically go to null if a constituent data element is null. First and last aggregate rules respect presence of null values. What that means, first and last aggregate rules. So these are functions. In dimensional packages, first and last are functions. So last period. So last period would mean that period which was just preceding to the current period. When I say last period sales, and if the period which is preceding to the current period does not have any sales, they are null, then in compatible query mode, it will go one level back and give you even the previous values as the last period values, which does not happen in dynamic query mode. If the last period has null values, it will be able to show you 0 sales for the last period. So it is more accurate if you are using dynamic query mode because it is able to interpret null values properly. Dynamic query mode connectivity. When you're using DQM, it does supported OLAP and relational data sources. It is able to connect to relational data sources as well as OLAP data sources. OLAP connectivity is done through native client libraries of the data source vendor. So OLAP connectivity through the dynamic cubes to Power Cubes to Sybase Cube, Oracle Cubes is done using native client libraries, which will be published by the provider. So Oracle will publish Oracle Cubes drivers. They are used to connect. Supported relational database source can maintain in compatible query mode or can be further modeled dimensionally to provide OLAP style experience as a dynamic query mode. So you can keep it in compatible query mode or you can use dynamic query mode to provide OLAP experience to the users. Relational connectivity is done through JDBC. If you're using dynamic query mode, then the relational databases have to be connected through JDBC. They cannot be only using compatible query connection. Report server execution mode. So we can configure it to 32-bit mode or 64-bit mode. So in a 64-bit installation, you can use 32-bit execution mode or 64-bit execution mode. If you use 32-bit mode, you can run CQM or DQM packages because CQM packages would need 32-bit, DQM packages would need 64-bit. With 32-bit execution mode, you can process both of them. But if you make it 64-bit execution mode, only DQM packages can be used. So if you're not sure about your environment, that you are not sure that all the reports being run are DQM enabled, then you should not change the report execution mode to 64-bit, or you should have a combined environment. You should have a environment where some of the dispatchers are 32-bit and other dispatchers are 64-bit, and through the routing rules, you are able to send the request to the right server. And we will do that in this training. We will set advanced dynamic routing rules. So you are able to see that 32-bit should go to 32-bit dispatcher, 64-bit should go to 64-bit dispatcher. And that we'll do in, I think, chapter number 4, the advanced routing rules.
Vinay?
Yeah.
I currently have a package that I've published in compatible query mode. Now, listening to the advantages of DQM, if I want to switch that, do I just switch it in Framework Manager and republish it? Or is there more that I would have to do?
No, you can, when you are publishing that package, there is a checkbox available there which says publish using dynamic query mode.
Okay, so I just have to check it and republish.
Yes.
Cool.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay. So describe IBM Cognos dynamic cubes. So dynamic cubes are a recent development, which were also available in 10.2.2, and 11 obviously has them. So they are designed for interactive analysis over large data warehouses. Dimensional view of a star or snowflake schema based on a single fact table. That is the limitation of a dynamic cube. It can only support one fact table and the dimensions which connect to that fact table. You can also have snowflake dimensions, but the fact table has to be only one. A dynamic cube can be deployed as an OLAP data source to the content manager. So when it's deployed, it is not deployed as a relational data source. It is deployed as a OLAP data source, just like it was a cube, but it resides completely in the memory. The dynamic cube is completely in the memory. All the aggregations are pre-calculated just like a cube file, but it is not a file, it is all in the memory. There are various caches I talked about. The dynamic cubes have got various caches: result set cache, expression cache, data cache, aggregate cache, and member cache. So result set cache would be the final results with the aggregates. Expression cache, the expressions which are used for calculating the results. Data cache, the raw data retrieved from the database, that is kept in the data cache. So if the subsequent query needs the same data which is available in the data cache, it will not send a query to the database but use the data cache itself. Aggregate cache, where the aggregate values are stored. Member cache, a dimension, each level will have members, and those members are also stored in a cache. So taking advantage of all these caches, dynamic cubes are able to give quick performance over large data sets. Tier 2, which is application tier. Content manager is the only service which will contact the content store or the authentication provider. So it is able to authenticate the users using authentication store, and then through the JDBC connectivity is connected to the content store, from where it can get the specification of the reports, the results, output of the reports. If stored in content store, it is able to get the authentication authorization settings for any user, for any package. All that is stored in the content store. And access manager is under the content manager or the content manager service, which also encrypts the communication between the authentication store as well as the content store. Tier 3, the data store. So those are, the content store is one instance. As I said, you cannot have multiple content store for an environment. Only one content store would be there. Of course, you can keep a backup content store. At the database level, you can have 2 databases created which are replicated and then can be set to take over if one fails. But that will be at the database level. Cognos will only able to handle one content store at one time. You can have multiple data sources from where your company data would be. So you can have one database, multiple schemas. So all that will be your company data. Metric store is also a database, but for each scorecard application, you would need one metric store. So in one environment, you can have multiple databases which are metric stores. So data sources can use API, compatible connection, or JDBC, but content store would always need JDBC, and metric stores would also need JDBC connectivity. Log server. So you can have multiple dispatchers, multiple machines, and multiple dispatchers. All that will send the log files from the log server application to the log service to the file. That's the default. But you can also configure to connect a database, and we will do that in the installation. We will create an audit database. We'll connect the audit database and send the logs to the audit database. IBM Cognos Analytics Servlets. So we have got the dispatcher as a Java servlet. All the services are contained under the dispatcher, but report service and batch report service are not Java based, but they are C++ based. They are in their own containers, but they would still function under the dispatcher. The content manager has got its own Java servlet, which will talk to the content manager service to the content store as well as the authentication provider. And the Java servlet container by default is WebSphere Liberty Profile, but you can configure IBM Cognos Analytics to use a third-party application server other than WebSphere Liberty Profile if you so desire. IBM Cognos Analytics request processing. Now, request processing, the user will send a request through the browser to the gateway, which is optional. You may have it or you may not have it. If you don't have the gateway, then the request will directly go to the dispatcher. But if you have a gateway, it will come to the gateway and the gateway will pass on the request to the dispatcher. So number one is the request coming from the user. Now, depending upon if your environment is secured or unsecured. If it is a secured environment, you would need to log in. Then the presentation service will be sent the request to make a page for you to log in. But in case you're already logged in, then the request comes to the dispatcher, which will be sent to the report service. When you're running a report, it will be sent to the report service. So number 2 goes to the report service. Report service will need, if it needs to log in, it will send the request back to the dispatcher, number 3, which will then go to the content manager because it needs the report specification. First, the request is sent to the report service. Report service says, I need the report specification. Send the request back to the dispatcher, which will send it to the content manager, which will send it to the content store. From the content store, the report specification, the XML, is taken. So number 4, the specification is sent back to content manager, which will send it to the dispatcher, which will send to the report service, and the report service with the XML will get the data from the query database. So once it gets the data from the database, then number 5, it sends it back to the dispatcher. Dispatcher, the data which is received from the database is not presented in the fashion in which the report is. That is done by the presentation service. So dispatcher will send number 5 to the presentation service, which will present a page, which will create a page in the same fashion in which the report needs to show to the user. After the presentation service renders the page, it is sent back to the dispatcher, which through the gateway is sent to the user. So that is how the user sees the output of a report. Sends the request, dispatcher, sends to report service, back to the dispatcher, content manager, from the content store specification is taken, back to the dispatcher, report service, to the query database, gets the data, report service, dispatcher goes to the presentation service, which makes the page, sent back to the dispatcher from the gateway to the user. That is how the request processing is done. Any questions? Performance plan. Measured by effectiveness in completing tasks, how fast you can complete the tasks. That is a function of processing capacity and the workload. For the given workload, if you have got sufficient capacity, you are able to process the tasks faster. If the processing capacity is A, if your workload is less, you can still process the request faster because you got resources available. If your processing capacity is less, workload is more, you're not able to do them efficiently. So both the things, processing capacity as well as workload, have to be taken into account. So performance variables to consider: the capacity, scalability, and availability. So capacity is how many requests are going to come. How much processing do I need? Scalability, I want to be able to scale the performance up. So that could either be, if the single server is available, I add more RAM to it, if that is the bottleneck, or I can add more dispatchers to the environment. So that would be scalability. Availability would mean that my environment needs to remain up. It may not be that efficient, but it should be available. So for availability, we will have different considerations. There we'll talk about multiple servers, multiple dispatchers, so that it's not a single point of failure. And we'll also talk about multiple content manager services. So when the one content manager service fails, it would not bring the environment down. Installation planning. We can either decide to install all the components on one computer, or we can perform distributed installation. Multiple options are available for distributed installation, and we'll discuss all of them. What can be done and what advantages are given by that distributed installation. Install modeling components with or separately from the server components. Some companies would adopt a practice where the modeling components like Framework Manager, Dynamic Cube Designer, Transformer, or Matrix Designer, they would be installed on the same machine as the server. Why would they do that? That would be for licensing requirements. So once they install it on the server and users remote desktop on the server to work on Framework Manager, only one user at one time can work. So they are able to make sure that the licensing requirements are met. But ideally, you should install it on the desktop of the modeler. Reason, that would reduce the contention of resources on the Cognos server. We do not want the modeling components contending for the resources on the Cognos server, but you can install it on the same server also if you so desire. Recommended is on a separate machine, but then you need to make sure that you do not install too many places to keep within your license which you purchased. Separate the content store from other IBM Cognos Analytics components. Reason, the content store is the heart of the installation. So if for resource contention, the server goes down and content store goes down with it, no matter how many dispatchers you have, once the content store goes down, then your environment would be down. In the planning, you also need to consider 32-bit versus 64-bit components. What kind of data or what kind of data sources do you have? If you have power cubes, if you have cubes which are 32-bit, you do need to keep the installation execution mode as 32-bit if you want to service those. Or you could decide to have multiple dispatchers, one for 32-bit, other for 64-bit, have a mixed mode environment where you are able to service 32-bit components as well as 64-bit components. Install IBM Cognos Analytics on one computer. You can install all the components on one computer or you can distribute. Why would you install on one computer? For proof of concept purposes. When you are doing a development environment or you want to just are still considering whether Cognos would be the right tool to work with, you want to make some reports and show it to the people who will be making the decisions, you can install everything on one machine. So development or test environment, or for proof of concept, you can install web server gateway if you want to, it's optional, or dispatcher and content manager, everything is installed on one computer. It would be a one computer environment. In this training, we would install it on one computer, but we are not going to install just one dispatcher, we'll install two dispatchers. Install gateways on a separate computer. So computer A can have web server gateway, computer B can also have a web server gateway, and both of them connect to the dispatcher on computer C. Why would we do that? That would be done in a situation where either there are far too many requests coming, there are a lot of users accessing your environment, but those requests are not processing intensive. So processing capacity required is less. That is why we have used just one dispatcher. But number of requests coming are more. So we are using more than one gateway. That's one reason. Second reason could be that you've got an internal request coming in and external public facing requests coming in. You want to have two different web servers installed, one for internal request, one for external request. So you can separate them out. So this computer B, which could be for external request, can be kept outside the firewall and then can communicate to the dispatcher. Even if something happens to the external request computer, your internal environment would still be running. Your internal users will not be affected. So you can decide to install the web server gateway on more than one machine, but ultimately connected to the same application server. Separate application tier components and content manager. So in this installation configuration, what we have done is on computer A, we have installed the web server gateway. That can connect to multiple computers. There are dispatcher installed on computer B, dispatcher installed on computer C. And we have separated the content manager on computer D. Once we do that, now we could have installed the content manager on B or C also. But if we installed on B, and if B goes down, content manager goes down with it. Even if computer C is up and running, web server is up and running, my environment would be down because the content manager is down. In this case, because content manager is now on a separate machine, computer B or C, either one can go down, my environment would still be up. Because the web server is up, one dispatcher is up, content manager is up, this will be a complete environment. And that is the reason why content manager is recommended to be installed on a separate machine, or you want to have multiple content managers. So you can have one installed on B, one installed on C. Both of them have got their own content manager. Only one would be active at one time. But if that machine where the active content manager goes down, the second one will automatically take over. And in that case also, my environment would be up. So I can either install a content manager on separate machine or can have installed on multiple machines so that I've got multiple content manager services available. That is what is on the next slide. So what we've done here is one web server gateway, one dispatcher, second dispatcher, and multiple content managers installed. One would be active, others are standby. And all of them connect to the content store. If the machine with the content manager goes down, the other content manager service will automatically take over and your environment would be available. So to ensure failover protection, install standby content managers on more than one computer or on more than one dispatcher. Modeling tools can be installed on the server or can be installed on the user or modeler machines. They will communicate to the gateway or to the dispatcher because they ultimately do need to publish the content to the server. So they will connect through the, you can say, internal Cognos application firewall to the server. Okay, we are right now at 11:25 Central Time. Let us take a quick 5 minutes break. It has been a lot of theoretical stuff. Let's take a quick 5 minutes break, get up, and then we'll come back. And it will be just a half an hour session before lunchtime. So we'll finish this theoretical portion. I can see that there's a lot of theoretical. So let's take 5 minutes break, come back, and then we'll start at 11:30 Central Time. So when there's too much of slides and speaking, it can become a little too much. So we'll discuss load balancing mechanisms later. Next. Okay, so we'll come back at 11:30 Central Time. Just take 7 minutes break. Hello. Angie, Ha, Kirk, are you here?
Hey, how come my picture is not there? This is Sharon, by the way. I was trying to look for myself from the.
I can see you. Your
Oh, you
picture
can
is there.
see me? Okay, I
Yeah.
can't see myself, so it's weird. I just want to make sure I didn't drop off or something.
No, you're there. I can see you. Otherwise,
Okay.
I would have called you. So I see Kirk. I see everybody is there. So Hi is there too. Angie, are you here?
I am.
Okay, good. So we'll start and complete this chapter. And after that, there'll be a lot of work to do. I won't be speaking that much because that's the theoretical part, and that can sometimes become a little difficult at one go. So I decided to just throw in a break. So balance the load request. So you can use multiple instances of IBM Cognos Analytics components to balance the load of requests. So if there are multiple requests coming and you want to be able to send the request to the application server where capacity is available, you can do that by installing multiple dispatchers. So at the level of the dispatcher, the load balancing is automatic in a distributed installation. So the screen which is showing, we've got 3 web server gateways. Of course, they're all optional if you don't want that. But if you want the load balancing, then it has to go through the web server gateway, because each web server gateway is connected to a dispatcher, and all the dispatchers know the location of each other. So when a request comes to web server gateway 1, it will be sent to the web dispatcher which is connected to it, but then can be transferred to either of the dispatchers if it cannot be processed by the dispatcher where it is sent. So all 3 will be the same way. The request comes, it comes to the dispatcher. If it can process, it will. If it cannot process, it can send it to the first one or the third one. So it comes to anyone, it can be transferred to any dispatcher based on the processing capacity available. So load balancing options, 1 of 3. So what we do here is we install just one web server gateway with a dispatcher. So in this machine, the first one, there is a web server and also a dispatcher. So that dispatcher will know the location of these 3 servers. IBM Cognos server with dispatcher, Cognos server with dispatcher, Cognos server with dispatcher. It does not have, these 3 machines do not have a web server gateway installed on them. They only are dispatchers. But the main machine where the web server is installed also has a dispatcher. So that dispatcher will be central, which will be able to send the request to either of the dispatchers. So this dispatcher will be able to do load balancing and send the request to either of the dispatchers based on the capacity available. So implement load balancing without an external load balancing mechanism. Number 2, in this we have got multiple dispatch gateways installed. All 3 gateways are connected to one dispatcher which is installed on a separate machine. And in this case, the load balancing between the request coming to the web server is not there, but the request comes to any of the gateway, it will be sent to the central dispatcher, which will be able to send to either of the dispatchers available. So the dispatcher in the middle is a dedicated dispatcher, which is only supposed to be sending requests to other dispatcher. It would not be set to process the requests. That's a dedicated dispatcher. But should that dispatcher machine go down, because all the gateways know the dispatchers from the other machines, they would be able to connect to those dispatchers. Your environment will not go down even if the central dispatcher does go down.
What's the point of a central dispatcher then with that last setup?
So that one would be just a dispatcher which will be dedicated to sending requests. Now the advantage is if we install it on a web server gateway, if that gateway goes down, the dispatcher also goes down. In this case, the web server gateways are also not single point of failure. This one goes down, doesn't matter. Other two are also connected to the same dispatcher. This one goes down, does not matter. So we have actually taken away the single point of failure from this environment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is in that configuration, the scalability is easier, right? We can add any
Yes.
number of.
Yes. You can add any number of dispatchers, and just once you put the dispatcher in the system, it will be automatically load balanced. Or you could have external load balancing mechanisms available. So this is just a tier 1, tier 2. So you can have as many web servers you want, as many dispatchers you want, but if you use load balancing routers, they would be able to balance the load for all the components in tier 1 or tier 2. So you can employ external load balancing mechanism if you want. In that case, you will have to switch off the internal load balancing mechanism of Cognos. Request affinity. Once a request is sent from a user to the server, so affinity requests are assigned to a specific server or load balanced to another server. So based on low affinity, high affinity, or absolute affinity, based on that, the request would be sent to a specific server. So if you got a high affinity request, it would be sent to the same server which started the request. But if that server is no longer available, it can still be sent to a separate low affinity server. So IBM Cognos request affinity is either high or low or absolute. We cannot configure this because the requests are having the affinity internally. But you can configure the number of connections which will be used to fulfill a request. So request would always be needing a connection, a process to fulfill that request. So request would need a process and the request would need a connection. That we can configure, but we cannot configure the affinity for a request. Advanced dispatcher routing. And as we discussed a little while back, you are able to specify when a request comes, what dispatcher should it be sent to based on the routing rules. And once we set the routing rules, based on what rule is satisfied, the request will be sent to the appropriate server. So rules are defined and enforced based on packages or group and role. And we'll see that we'll actually do the advanced request routing in one of the chapters. Configure IBM Cognos Analytics. For all installations, the following components must be configured. Web server alias, if you are using gateways. If you don't use gateways, you do not need to configure web server alias. Data connection properties for the content stored. That is a must because every dispatcher should be able to connect to the content store. So content store connection has to be configured in every dispatcher which you install. And web browsers need to be configured to allow cookies so that the passports can be passed on. Modify the default configuration. Why would we do that? When you want to change port numbers, if you are installing more than one dispatcher on the same machine, we need to change the port number so there are no clashes between the dispatchers. Use a different gateway interface. So if you do not want to use WebSphere Liberty profile, you want to use another different gateway interface, then you will need to configure it in configuration. Implement security, a source control system or notification services. So you want to configure email server, you need to do that. Or security, which means authentication provider will have to be configured in the Cognos configuration. Use an alternate auditing destination. You want to not use the file-based system, you want to use a database, you will be configuring that in Cognos configuration. Use a different cryptographic provider. So cryptographic provider is used when we say Cognos application firewall. The communication between different components of Cognos will be using that cryptographic provider. By default, a cryptographic provider comes along with the installation, which is used for encrypting the communication between different components, but you can use a separate cryptographic provider if you want. If you want to configure that, you would need to read the administration and configuration manual to be able to configure that. Configure a gateway to point to a namespace. When you configure multiple authentication providers into the same dispatcher, if you try to log in, Cognos will ask you what namespace you want to log into. But you can configure a default namespace, so when the users log in, they'll be logged into that particular namespace only. Modify the global configuration. We saw that in the last chapter. In Cognos configuration, there were added global configuration. We were able to see that we are able to customize language support for the user interface, currency support, various currencies, fonts, content locale, or the language used for product user interface. And you can add new fonts to the IBM Cognos Analytics environment. All that is done by modifying the global configuration. In a distributed installation, you must configure content managers. So as many content managers you install, they should all be known to each other. So the address of all content managers would be available in each configuration. Application tier components. So those also, dispatcher addresses also need to be known in the distributed installation. And gateway computers, if you do install them, then the gateway URL also needs to be configured. Cryptographic properties can also be configured, but they do come by default, but if you want to change them, you can. After configuration, you must start the services on the content manager computer first. So whatever computer contains the default content manager, services on that computer must be started first. If you do not, then you will get errors, because content manager is the only service which can contact the content store. And content store has got all the information about the content store connection, email server, audit server, all that is available in the content manager. So if you do not start the content manager computer first, you're likely to get errors. Configure logging. So by default, the logging is file-based, but we are able to add a logging resource as the database, and then you can create an audit database. We can name it whatever we want, and then we will give the configuration parameters for the audit database to be able to connect to it. So the audit logs not only go to the file, they would also go to the database. Cognos application firewall. So we did see that when we go to IBM Cognos firewall, it is set to true, but I can configure the security to specify what domains or what hosts can connect to the environment. I can provide specific IP addresses or specific domain names. Only those will be able to connect to the IBM Cognos environment. By default, it is set to all. So anybody can connect to the environment, but if you want additional security, you can specify IP addresses or domain names in this application firewall configuration, so only those computers will be able to connect. That finishes this unit, but let me quickly show you where the IBM Cognos audit can be set. Let me show that to you. You will do that in the next exercise, but if I switch back to the labs, and if I log in as Cognos configuration, so from start, all programs, analytics. Now, by default, the logging is file. So if I right-click logging, I'm able to create new resource. And if I click on new destination, I'm able to specify what type of destination that is. So I can specify the database type, or I can have file log server. So I can set a database and I give it a name, let us say, so that adds a new resource. If I right click database, I'm able to create a new resource, a type of database, and then I can specify what type of database that is. So now once I create the database, here I do need to give it connection parameters to an actual database on the database server, and then I'm able to send the logs to that particular database. So I don't intend to do that anyway, so I just wanted to show you where we can create a new database. Okay, any questions? Okay, so we are on the exercise 1. Before we break for lunch, I would need to make sure at least we can start the installation after lunch, but at page number 2-69, I want to make sure that everybody of you is set for starting the installation on the next machine. So if you switch back to the labs, click on the very first icon and click View All VMs. Once you are on View All VMs, I would like you to suspend the first machine. So click on Suspend this VM. And make sure that your suspend the VM is complete before you move ahead. It will take some time to suspend this.
So while we are waiting for it to suspend, I have a question. So, what are the factors that we need to consider to know that we need more dispatchers? If I'm looking at a scalability options, what would determine that I need like add one more dispatcher?
That would be once you look at your parameters, your metrics, you see that number of successful requests is going down, number of unsuccessful requests is going up. So you are not able to process them properly, or you say queue wait times are increasing. So you will come to know from there that your current environment is not able to adequately service what you need to do. So there you will decide that I need another dispatcher. So once you are able to suspend that,
Is this taking so long because we're all trying to do the same thing at the same time?
No, these are all your separate environments. But yes, that could be because operation is pending and will be completed as soon as possible. That error could be because everybody's trying to do it at the same time.
Okay.
And I want to take this time before we break for lunch, so make sure that we are all set for starting the installation once we come back from lunch. Lunch 1.
So mine is suspended.
So if yours is suspended, you will go ahead and start the second machine. So there is a start icon, the play icon for the second machine. 2, 3, 4, start that. So click on that start icon.
Vinay, mine still says running.
That would be S2, right?
Yes.
S2, let me check for S2.
So,
yeah, it is saying operation is pending and will be completed as soon as possible. So you just need to wait.
okay. I hit refresh and then I tried to hit suspend again, but you're telling me it's in process. It's just taking a while.
Yeah, because now all your buttons are grayed out, so you cannot click on suspend anymore, can you?
Nope.
Yeah, so it is saying operation is pending and will be completed as soon as possible. Once it starts showing you busy instead of running, then it has already started doing that for you.
Okay.
So I see S4, S5 is now suspending, S6 is also pending, S7, S7, that was whom? Sharon. So yours looks like it is suspended. So you can start the second one now.
Yes, I already did. I already
Okay.
clicked the second one.
Okay.
Yeah, it says busy.
Okay. S2, yours got suspended. So you can start the second one now.
Vinay, not that we are going to reach the maximum limit on the number of dispatches, but is there a limit on the number of dispatches we can have?
No. There is no limit.
Hey, Sharon, is yours still busy?
Sharon would be number 7, right, Sharon?
Yes. Yeah, mine's still busy.
Okay. Mine too. That's why I asked.
Yeah.
Okay, number 4 would be Ha, right? Ha, you can start your second machine now.
Yes, I'm starting number 2. My machine 2.
Okay. So everybody is just starting the second machine. The first one is done. Okay, S6 is done, right? S6 was Sarah. Sarah, your machine has come up, right?
Yes, it says running.
Okay, so now once you go inside the machine, on page number 2-69, the task 1 is to make sure all the services are set to automatic and they are started. So just check those services.
Okay, looks like mine is done. The S7 is done for the
Okay.
second machine.
Yes. So it's done for you. So if you click on the services icon at the bottom taskbar,
Where is it?
the taskbar at the bottom, the gray bar, there is a services icon, which is like 2 gears.
Oh, hold on.
You see that?
I just click into it.
Yeah, click on that.
Okay.
No, at the bottom, the taskbar at the bottom. Yeah, you see that services now? This one?
Okay, this one doesn't have any start bar or something.
No. See, you might need to scroll down a bit.
Oh, I see. Okay. Sorry.
See,
I was
see
like
the
looking at
services.
it. Yeah.
See the services? Yeah.
This one?
The second from the left, second from the right. Yeah, this one.
Okay.
Okay. Now make sure the services in the book. S1, Amy, yours are also done. S2 is done too. S3 is just starting Windows. S4 is still starting. S5 is still pending. S5 is Kirk, right?
Correct.
Okay. Okay, now yours is starting. Double click on services, Angie. Yeah. So now you need to make sure that the services given in the book, Apache Directory Server, DB2 Copy 1, DB2 DAS, Lotus Domino Server, and Worldwide Web Publishing Services are set to automatic and they are started. Okay, and started. S4, yours is done. S5 is also done. So everybody has started.
And where should I go now? I'm S4.
S4.
Okay.
Okay, so click on the services icon at the bottom.
The, in what machine?
Machine 2. That's
Machine
where you were
2.
supposed to go, the second machine, yeah.
Okay, I see it now.
Yeah.
Services. And
So
so
make
what
sure the
page?
services.
And
Yeah,
what page?
Apache.
What page? What page is
269?
269?
269, yes. And DAS also, Sharon, you're supposed to make it automatic, not manual. So DB to DAS, you did not change that
Oh,
to,
hold on.
yeah.
How do I change that back?
Properties, go to properties. Right click and go to properties.
Oh, property.
Change it to automatic.
Okay.
Do that for all of them.
Okay, that one. And then
DB to copy one. DB to copy one. No, the up. No, not this one.
not that one.
DB to copy one, DB2. Up, above. Keep
This
going
one.
up. Keep going. No, keep going up.
Oh, this
This one.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. And Lotus Domino server. Once you have completed task 1, we can break for lunch and come back at 12:30 Central, which will be 1:30 Eastern.
Okay, I think I got all 5 started.
Okay, that's good then. So see you after lunch.